Even as the U.S. escalates to war around the world, China is an island of stability and growth, seeking peaceful resolution to conflicts, both kinetic and economic, and ushering in the possibility of a multilateral, multipolar world of sovereign states. What are the lessons of China's ascent on the world stage? What are the forces that seek to derail it? What are the geopolitical dynamics at play in the twilight of the U.S. empire? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, KJ No. These are this week's headlines. NATO chief warns China could trigger World War III by asking Russia to attack NATO. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte claimed that Chinese leader Xi Jinping could urge Putin to attack NATO when attempting to seize Taiwan. This could spark World War III, according to Rutte. If Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, he would first make sure that he makes a call to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, telling him, hey, I'm going to do this, and I need you to keep them busy in Europe by attacking NATO territory. The accusation here is most likely a confession. NATO has been enlisted in U.S. plans to trigger world war against China using Korea, Japan, Taiwan Island, and Philippines as flashpoints and proxies. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev called the idea preposterous. Secretary General Rutte has clearly gorged on too many of the magic mushrooms beloved by the Dutch. China tops Nature Index's 2025 research leaders. According to the prestigious British Journal of Science, Nature, the United States is losing ground as China's lead expands rapidly in scientific research. According to Nature Index, China's contribution to world-class science is advancing so quickly that its lead over the United States has multiplied by more than 4 times in just 1 year. Nature noted that the U.S. lost the top spot in research to China in 2023. In the 2024 Share Index, China's share of the contribution to research was 32,122 in 2024. The United States share was 22,083. Northwestern University sued over suicide of professor targeted in China investigation. According to the Chicago Tribune, the estate of Northwestern University professor Jane Wu, who died by suicide last year, is being investigated after being investigated in a controversial federal probe, is suing the school for allegedly discriminating against her and evicting her from her lab, blaming the university in part for her death. Professor Wu was a tenured faculty member and a researcher in neurobiology, molecular biology, and genetics at the School of Medicine. For nearly 2 decades, she did cutting-edge work in seeking treatments for neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's. Unfortunately, she was one of hundreds of Chinese American scientists ensnared in the Justice Department's China Initiative that people have referred to as the crime of researching while Chinese. Professor Wu was never charged with any wrongdoing. Despite that, the school reassigned her grant to a male colleague, shut down her lab, and according to a civil complaint, forcibly admitted her to the university's psychiatric hospital. She committed suicide not long after. The Dalai Lama declares Swiss-based NGO will decide his next reincarnation. The Dalai Lama, after dithering whether he would be reincarnated or not, has declared that a Swiss-based NGO will determine his reincarnation, which would occur in the so-called free world. This goes against the traditional method of the golden urn lottery, which has historically determined the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is one of two leaders of the Gelugpa sect, which is just one of 5 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The institution of the Dalai Lama was created and conferred by the Ming tributary king Shunyi, also known as Altan Khan, upon Sonam Gyatso, the leader of the Gelugpa at the time. 10 subsequent Dalai Lamas have all been endowed by Beijing, including the current 14th. The 2 previous Dalai Lamas prior to the third were grandfathered in as reincarnations. The notion of a reincarnating leader, referred to as a tulku, came out of a specific political circumstance and set of needs. First, it was intended to thwart assassination. Second, to ensure the succession of theocratic power inside a celibate order, that is to say, to ensure continuity of patriarchal dominance through a myth of male motherhood, divine, self-reproducing male. Historians say the Dalai Lama has no more authority to decide his successor or his method of succession than the Pope has to decide his. Tradition dictates succession. However, the Dalai Lama was funded and used by the CIA for political purposes to undermine China for decades. And this politicization will likely continue with his so-called reincarnation. In fact, the U.S. passed a law in 2020 which asserted against tradition that the Dalai Lama would determine his own reincarnation, and which would also sanction Chinese officials who challenged that U.S. agenda. Even as the U.S. increases chaos around the world and creeps closer and closer to war with China, China offers stability, peace, and development to the global South, giving hope for a new and better world of multilateral equals. It is seeking peaceful resolution to conflicts, both kinetic and economic, while knitting countries together through BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. What are the lessons and impacts of China's ascent to the world stage? What are the forces and factors that seek to derail it? And what are the geopolitical dynamics at play, in particular, the US's desire for continued hegemony? And what role can people of conscience in the West play? Analyst, activist, and the organizer and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, and the author of The East is Still Red, Carlos Martinez, joins us to discuss this. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, KJ. Great to see you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We've tried to have you on for quite a little moment, so I'm glad we finally get to have you on the show. I wanted to start by asking you about your recent trip to China. I know that you were in China for several weeks, and I was curious as to what observations you had about China from this most recent trip.
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough to be in China for almost 3 weeks. The first week of it as part of a Beijing Review organized trip, where we went to Chongqing and we went to Chengdu and Beijing. And then for just over a week and a half on a Friends of Socialist China delegation with, I think, 9 or 10 people from Britain and 5 or 6 from the US, mainly composed of young people and mainly composed of people who'd never been to China before. And we went to Xi'an and also to Yan'an, so did some red tourism up in the caves in Yan'an, and then went to the far west to Gansu in the desert, went to Dunhuang, went to Jiayuguan, and then 3 or 4 days in Shanghai. So we did a variety of things and had a variety of experiences. And the Friends of Socialist China delegation, which was hosted by an NGO, the China NGO Network for International Exchanges, was really focused on sort of civilizational exchanges So some of the theory and practice around the Global Civilization Initiative, and that whole focus on presenting China's view of global politics and mutually beneficial relations between nations and between peoples. And that was really interesting. And all of us come from the West, as I say, from mainly from Britain and the United States, where the default worldview that's being pushed very heavily by politicians and by journalists is that of a new Cold War, is that of a clash of civilizations, is that of a Thucydides trap, where China is rising and there will inevitably be conflict between the US as the lead protagonist in the existing world order and China as the kind of pretender, as the challenger to the throne, if you like. Where China's vision is, much more rounded, much more positive, much more oriented towards peace. China adheres very closely to the principles of peaceful coexistence and to the principles of common prosperity and non-interference and mutual benefit, and the principles of international law and of the United Nations Charter. So as far as China's concerned, it should be possible for all countries to do well, to prosper, and to enjoy a peaceful and sustainable existence. And that's really the focus of their whole foreign policy. So we learned a lot about that. It was a lot about building grassroots, people-to-people friendship. And we also did quite a lot of road tourism. I went with Danny Haifeng, who you're also good friends with, to some kind of revolutionary history sites in Chongqing, including a couple of memorial halls for prisons where massacres had taken place in 1949, just before Chongqing was liberated. These were communist prisoners who were being incarcerated by the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang people who operated these prisons saw the writing on the wall and carried out a completely unnecessary, vengeful massacre of the prisoners there. And it was really interesting to see how seriously people in China take that history. We were the only foreigners there. I think we were quite possibly the only foreigners to have ever been there. But there were busloads and busloads of school children and older people who were reviewing this history, and you got a sense of how connected people feel to their revolutionary history, and how connected people feel to that revolutionary generation. The generation or two generations or three generations that fought for China's liberation, that fought against Japanese occupation and aggression, that fought against the Kuomintang and against imperialism and against warlordism, and that fought to build socialist China and to completely turn around the fortunes of the Chinese people and to end the century of humiliation and to establish the essentially very good life that people enjoy these days, with higher living standards than have ever been experienced in Chinese history, with a life expectancy which is comparable with that of the advanced capitalist countries of the West, and which has, as you know, surpassed that of the United States, and where people really feel that life is getting better, that they have opportunities, they feel optimistic, where they enjoy the best infrastructure in the world, where the country is the world's first renewable energy superpower and is the core of this whole multipolar process and the core of this, establishing a system of international relations based on peace and sustainability and common prosperity. So people feel really proud, and they understand where these current conditions originate from historically, and they feel very closely connected to that. So yeah, it was a really interesting, really varied trip. A few of the delegates, as I say, saw China for the first time, including Jackie Luqman, who's national organizer with Black Alliance for Peace. She was able to see China for the first time. And, I think it is quite an emotional thing seeing China for the first time. When you come from a city like Washington, D.C., where Jackie comes from, or London, where I come from, or Oakland, where you come from, or New York City, where other delegates come from, these are places that are part of, the capitalist West. In theory, they're among the most affluent, the richest cities in the world. And yet what do you see anywhere you go in London? What do you see anywhere you go in New York City? You see crumbling infrastructure, you see homelessness, you see extreme absolute poverty, and you see desperation and massive inequality and extreme poverty and all the social problems that come with that. People don't feel safe and people don't have a sense that their basic needs are covered. Whereas you go to a city like Shanghai, which is a huge, mega city of maybe 23, 25 million people, which certainly has inequality, and certainly has, for example, Western brands like Starbucks and McDonald's and whatnot. And tons of people, very crowded, very busy, but you feel, one, a sense of safety, two, a sense that everybody's basic needs are met. You don't see homeless people in Shanghai or Beijing or in Xi'an, these massive cities. And three, a sense of optimism, of positivity. People are enjoying their lives. They appreciate that their lives are better than life in China was 10 or 20 years ago, and there's an expectation that life will continue to get better. So it's really powerful to come to China for the first time and to experience that positivity at a time when things are getting worse in the West, and people don't have that positivity. Quite the opposite. People have a sense of doom that we're really experiencing a general collapse of capitalism, and we're living in a moribund society, which is increasingly chaotic, which is increasingly violent, which is increasingly unequal, which increasingly is impoverished, and which increasingly doesn't even accord us basic democratic freedoms. So yeah, it was a very, very, very interesting trip.
And it also sounds like it's a bit of a letdown to come back to London.
Certainly. Well, yeah, if you wake up every day for 3 weeks and you're inspired all day and every day, then it's very difficult to come back to normal reality here. Especially, I could walk probably 50 meters outside my front door and see homelessness and see really intense poverty and people with absolutely no social welfare whatsoever. Drug addiction is rife and it's getting worse. Homelessness is rife and it's getting worse. The life expectancy is slowly declining. There's massive propaganda against immigrants. There's massive propaganda against non-white people. So racism is a problem that's getting worse and has been for the last 10, 15 years or so, after a trajectory where, thanks to heroic, courageous and ongoing fight of Black communities over the course of decades and centuries, racism has been felt less viscerally. But with capitalism in this period of intense crisis, then the ruling class is leveraging racism. So we see racism getting worse. We see sexism getting worse, and misogyny and domestic violence getting worse. People have no sense of job security. It's very difficult to get meaningful work for young people leaving school or leaving college. Very difficult to get a job that's kind of commensurate with their level of skill. And once you do get a job, then it's very insecure. The majority of people are going into the casual economy or going into the gig economy, into zero-hour contracts, and so on. So, we're surrounded by, as I say, a sense of foreboding, a sense of doom, a sense that things are getting worse. Last summer, there were race riots, essentially of disaffected white people, responding to media propaganda against immigrants and rioting on that basis. There's every possibility that will happen again. The confidence in the government, the confidence in the state is at an all-time low. I think Prime Minister Keir Starmer's approval rating stands at about 15% or something historically disastrous. You've got a government that, on the one hand, doesn't recognize that a genocide is taking place in Gaza, that does support everything that Israel does, that does support the US and Israeli completely criminal attack on Iran. And then at the same time, when people engage in peaceful protest against those things, against genocide, then the people protesting are labeled as terrorists. And we're in this crazy situation now in Britain where the group Palestine Action, which is a peaceful protest group, has been branded as terrorists. So on Saturday, which was the first day that this new law came into force, there was a protest of people supporting Palestine Action in central London in Parliament Square, so just outside the seat of government, and 29 people were arrested, including an 83-year-old woman, because they were holding placards saying, "We oppose genocide and we support Palestine Action." So this is what our government is doing, all at the same time as they're deepening austerity, they're deepening neoliberalism, they're deepening privatization. So this is the political culture here. This is what we enjoy from the so-called end of history and capitalist liberal democracy.
I can only tell you that, we have the same phenomena happening in the United States, and I would argue in most of the, northern Western capitalist states. I wanted to pick up a little bit more on what you said about China's development and how hard won it was. I recall, one of the first times I went to China, talking to some Chinese students, and they spoke, with great passion, how hard their grandparents and parents had worked, and that they had actually been able to receive this good society on the basis, of the work of the state and their family members. And they were horrified, absolutely horrified at the thought that the United States was escalating to war against them for something that they could not understand at all. That they had done nothing to the United States. They had not harmed the United States. They had simply wished to have trade and good relations. And somehow this was a casus belli for the United States. It's just completely, it blew their minds, if you will. And I'd just like to, pick up on the global geodynamics, geopolitics, the dynamics that are leading us to war against China. How do you analyze what's happening in the world right now and why the U.S. is so hostile to China?
Well, the plan for China, since China had become integrated into the global economy from the late 1970s onwards, the idea was that with economic reforms and opening up, China would also reform its political system and open up to, Francis Fukuyama's end of history, and that China would accept its place, its permanent position at the bottom of global capitalism, essentially producing T-shirts, producing toys for Western consumers, and with this massive, well-educated labor force earning very little money. Of course, that was never China's plan. The Deng Xiaoping leadership from 1978 onwards was always very clear that the reason for integrating into the global economy, the reason for integrating, for introducing market reforms, the reason for accepting foreign direct investment was not that the Chinese working class could become a permanent low-paid labor force for the West, but that China could learn technology, China could learn new management techniques, China could attract capital, and on that basis, move up the value chain and itself become a high-value economy, so that China could develop, so that China could modernize, all the while maintaining its political system, maintaining what the Chinese leadership refers to as the four cardinal principles. So we continue on the socialist path, we maintain the role of the Communist Party of China, we continue to adhere to Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and we continue the dictatorship, the rule of the working class and the peasantry. So it was what China is doing right now, and the way that China has managed to rise, and the way that China has managed to emerge as a science and technology superpower, such that it's literally leading the world in renewable energy, in telecommunications, in advanced infrastructure, in space exploration, in supercomputing, in quantum computing, and so on. That this was the plan, and this was never a secret. The leadership of the Communist Party of China never made a secret of this, but the strategists in Washington and in London desperately hoped that what would actually happen is that China would gradually just be absorbed into the US-led imperialist world system. And it's by this point absolutely clear that that's not happening. And I think that realization starts around 20 years ago, and then becomes formalized with the Obama-Clinton pivot to Asia from 2011, which every administration, Democratic or Republican, has really continued. And that's focused on building a new Cold War against China and developing a campaign of encirclement and containment of China, which has got multiple components. It includes Donald Trump's current tariff madness. It includes Joe Biden's semiconductor war. It includes the creation of the AUKUS nuclear pact between Britain, the United States, and Australia. It includes the creation of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It includes the ramping up of tensions along the Taiwan Strait, and this notion of China provoked the People's Republic of China into potentially massively damaging war in relation to Taiwan. It includes trade wars, it includes sanctions, it includes a propaganda war. But ultimately, the end game is suppressing China's rise, encircling China, containing China, reducing China's kind of weight in the world. And it's, the fact is that China is the number one trading partner of around 3/4 of the world's countries. Around 2/3 of the world's countries are signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, including, I think, every African country other than one, Eswatini, is signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. The vast majority of Latin America, the vast majority of the Caribbean, of the Pacific, of Southeast Asia, of Central Asia, of the Middle East. So, and China's at the core of BRICS. China's at the core of the G20. China's at the core of the Belt and Road. China's at the core of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. So China is, really at the center of this emerging multipolar world order, which is the absolute last thing that the US and its allies want to see in the world. So opposing China, reducing its influence, and ultimately reversing the Chinese Revolution, and bringing about some kind of regime change that could lead to the dismantling of the People's Republic of China and the reversal of Chinese socialism. That's the end game. That's where these strategists are aiming, and that's the essential reason for the level of anti-China hostility that we're seeing.
I would absolutely agree with you, and I would actually pinpoint the date of the transition or the acceleration of hostility towards China at 2008, when the global financial system collapsed. And China was strong and remained strong and actually helped the rest of the world come out of this financial spiral. And because of that, no good deed goes unrewarded. That is when the United States explicitly started preparations for war against China. In 2009, it began to draft a doctrine of war against China called air-sea battle, which is based on the old Soviet-era air-land battle, which itself is based on Israeli war doctrine, primarily based on, aggressive decapitation strikes deep inside China. Prior to that, I think the belief of the Hillary Clinton, Gordon Chang cabal was that China would collapse of its own contradictions because it was a Potemkin state. But I want to, pivot to a statement on Friends of Socialist China. It's an article which was written by a comrade, which I think is very, very important. And he says that the lessons for the global world or the global left are that, the Chinese experience shows that masked communist politics are the only force capable of responding to the contradictions of our time. China's anti-poverty measures, commitment to building an ecological civilization, autonomous development provide a powerful counterexample to the moral rot and immiseration of capitalist imperialism. Your comments, Carlos?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strong statement, but I think it is important to look at why China has achieved what it's been able to achieve. China threw unbelievable resources into this project of eliminating extreme poverty. Literally 3 million cadres were sent around the country and spent, 12 months, 18 months in these places, working with individuals, working with families, working with communities, working with villages to establish what their problems were and how to find a sustainable, lasting, and permanent route out of poverty. It's to be able to put that level of resources into a project of poverty alleviation that's not about creating profit for a private company, but which is very specifically and directly about improving people's lives, is quite extraordinary, to such a degree that we basically can't imagine it happening in a country like Britain or in a country like the United States. And ultimately, the reason that something like that can happen, or the reason that China can emerge as the renewable energy superpower, and China's responsible now for around 50% of all renewable energy production and usage in the world, and 70% of the world's electric vehicles are created in China, 70% of the world's high-speed rail is in China, 96% of the world's electric buses are manufactured in China. China's leading the world in afforestation, China's leading the world in pollution reduction, China's leading the world in biodiversity protection and wildlife conservation, and all of these things. China has advanced infrastructure and transport rolled out across the entire country. I've taken a high-speed rail from Dunhuang in Gansu to Urumqi in Xinjiang. These are both places that don't have a massive population. There's no way that high-speed rail route would become profitable for literally decades. There's no private rail company in the world that would build that on the basis that they're trying to make a profit and they're trying to keep their shareholders happy. But China does these things. And ultimately, the reason it's able to do those things is the location of political power in ordinary working people and the leadership of the Communist Party of China. The fact that the important decisions are made not in the interests of profit, not in the interests of capital, not in the interests of that small group of people that owns capital and deploys capital, but in the interests of the people. And that's how China's political system works. I'm sure you remember from John Pilger's film, The Coming War on China, where John Pilger says to Eric Lee, Shanghai venture capitalist, actually, and political analyst, John Pilger says, well, you have branches of Starbucks here in Shanghai. There seems to be significant inequality. Obviously, there are rich people and there are poor people. So what's the difference between China and the United States? Isn't China just another capitalist country? And Eric Lee just explains in an extremely effective, extremely simple way, look, we may have billionaires in China, but they don't tell the government what to do. The government tells them what to do. We allow capital to exist to the extent and to the degree that it helps with China's overall development, that it helps Chinese people progress, that it helps us to modernize. Whereas in the United States, capital has enshrined rights, and the the direction of power, the direction of instructions goes from the billionaires to Congress, to the Senate, to the president, to the White House, to the State Department. So that's the fundamental difference, is that in China, the working people, the working class, the peasantry, intellectuals, and so on, constitute the ruling class. And the capitalist people who own and deploy capital, not only are they not the ruling class, they're not actually allowed to organize as a class. It would be literally illegal and unconstitutional for capitalists to have a political party that represented their specific interests as opposed to the interests of the people as a whole. Whereas in the United States, in Britain, in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, etc., the only political parties that anyone can vote for are capitalist parties, are parties that represent the interests of capital, of profit, of the elite. So that's exactly why China is able to do what it can do. That's exactly why China is able to put such resources into tackling poverty, into becoming a renewable energy superpower, into saving the planet. And that's exactly why China follows the foreign policy that it does. If capital were in charge in China, then there's nothing to say that China wouldn't try and become an imperialist country, that it wouldn't try and assert its domination over the rest of the world's land, labor, resources, and markets. But because it's in the overall Chinese people's interest to have, great relations and mutually beneficial relations with all countries of the world, and especially the global South, then capitalism isn't allowed to do that. Capital isn't allowed to play that role. And therefore, China is performing this function, as I described earlier, at the core of an emerging multipolar process. So I think the assertion that's made in the article that you referred to is a bold one, but it's fundamentally correct.
I tend to think that too. And I also want to highlight, what you said about, these so-called allegations that China is, quote unquote, capitalist. I think there's a thinking error there, a fallacy, which I refer to as the has-is fallacy. That is, China has capitalist, therefore it is capitalist. I don't think you can, reliably or, logically assert that. And I would also point out that this is actually a capitalist mode of thinking. This is how capitalists reason. What you have is what you are. And the more you have, the more you are. And so this kind of fallacious thinking is applied sometimes by even people on the left to make these wrong assertions about China. I mean, the United States has socialists, but it certainly is not socialist by any stretch of the imagination. So I wanted to touch lightly on foreign policy, and in particular, the kind of chaos and violence and havoc that is happening right now in West Asia, in the in the Middle East. We see these attacks on Iran, what looks to be like a serious effort to instigate war and to initiate regime change, along with this constant and ongoing and unbelievable genocide against the Palestinians. How do you analyze these developments inside this, global geopolitical picture of the U.S.'s striving for unipolar hegemony and China's rise on the global stage?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question that very few people are talking about, actually. Obviously, in terms of the Israeli and US justification for their so-called 12-day war in Iran, it's about Iran's nuclear proliferation and this idea that they're enriching uranium to nuclear grade. In reality, everybody knows that Iran has no nuclear weapons, and it's not trying to get them. There's literally a religious edict that's been issued against not just nuclear weapons development, but the weapon of any kind of weapon of mass destruction, and which has caused a lot of people to question whether this is really a good idea, and has caused a number of people, including in the mainstream media, to point out that, well, one country that hasn't been subjected to war from the US and its allies is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And the reason for that is that it does have nuclear weapons and is very clearly able to defend itself. But people know that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and is very strongly opposed to nuclear weapons. People know that Iran has a right to peaceful nuclear energy development. People know that Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that Israel isn't, and that Israel is an illegal and undeclared nuclear weapons state. So, yeah, in terms of this justification for this war, everyone can see through the nonsense. Everyone can see through the lies, and I think people understand, generally speaking, that Iran is being punished for its support for Palestine and for the fact that, you know, of any state in the world, Iran does more and has done more to support the Palestinian resistance materially, with money, with weapons, with diplomatic support, and all the rest of it. And zooming out a little bit to the whole region, Israel is clearly on a quest to weaken the whole axis of resistance, and it scored a major victory in recent months, sadly, with the dismantling of the Syrian Arab Republic. It's been able to make a significant hit against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's attacking, of course, the people in Gaza and West Bank and the people in Yemen, and weakening Iran and trying to bring about regime change in Iran is an important part of that overall strategy of dismantling the axis of resistance in the region. But the China component and the geopolitical component is also very important if we look at it from a global basis and a long-term basis. You know, just a few years ago in 2021, Iran and China signed a huge, unprecedented 25-year cooperation agreement with literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese investment in the Iranian economy, in infrastructure and energy, in digital technology, in advanced industry, and so on. A couple of years ago, Iran joined the Belt and Road Initiative. A couple of years ago, Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think just last year, Iran joined BRICS. Meanwhile, Iran is China's number one trading partner in the region, in West Asia. China's the number one buyer of Iranian oil, and constituting around 15% of China's oil imports. And it's sort of generally understood that that has been indispensable for Iran in terms of responding to the US's illegal unilateral sanctions against it. And yeah, as I mentioned before, Iran provides a huge amount of support to the Palestinian people. Iran provides support to national liberation movements. Iran provides support to the people of Yemen. Iran is very close with China. It's very close with Russia. It's very close with Venezuela. It's very close with Cuba. You know, Iran is an anti-imperialist state. And Michael Flynn, who people would remember was the national security advisor in the early days of Trump's first administration, explicitly said that regime change in Tehran is necessary for us because and that it benefits the US because it weakens China. So this is, you know, the overall geopolitics to this war against Iran, and I think to some degree the war against the Palestinian people as well. You know, the idea of a two-state solution has been on the table in Palestine for decades and decades, and you know, it's written into international law, and the vast majority of countries in the world supported and recognized it, and indeed recognized the Palestinian state on that basis of 1967 borders, including the West Bank, including Gaza, including East Jerusalem. It's, from a Palestinian point of view, it's an incredibly generous offer, because they're saying, fine, you've driven us off our land, and we'll accept a state based on around 20% of historic Palestine. But the Israelis have never accepted it. They've never been willing to go through with it. The US has never accepted it. The US has never been willing to go through with it. And I do think a very big part of the reason is that everybody knows that an independent Palestine, with control of its own borders, with control of its own economy, with control of its own foreign policy, with the right of return, would be a friend of the global South, would be a friend of China, would be a friend of Russia, would be a friend of progressive Latin America, would be a friend of Africa, would be a friend of all the countries and all the movements that have supported it over the decades. Of course it would. So, an independent Palestine would be part of this rising, progressive, multipolar, multilateral world order that adheres to the principles of peaceful coexistence, that adheres to the principles of the United Nations Charter, that adheres to the principles of international law. And that's the absolute last thing that the United States and its allies want to see in the world. So I think all of this conflict that we're seeing in the world, in Gaza, in Iran, in Ukraine, in Yemen, it's all related to the wider picture, to Brzezinski's grand chessboard of preventing the emergence of a multipolar world.
I agree with you. And the other person I would mention is Kurt Campbell, who has referred to it simply as a unified field. And he has also threatened to unleash a magnificent symphony of death in order to achieve his aims on that. So I think that we could go on and discuss many, many topics, but in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap it up for today with the understanding that we would love to have you back, Carlos, to discuss more and in more depth other details. And if you could give us a quick, if you could let us know where people can reach you and follow your work.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a joy to talk, and I very much hope we can do so again very soon. So I am co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China website. The URL for that website is socialistchina.org. We post typically around 10 articles a week, some original, others sourced from different places around the internet. But I think it's fair to say that it's certainly one of the best places in the English-speaking language to get, up-to-date, reliable analysis on the question of China and Chinese socialism. I can be found on Twitter or X or at agent of change with underscores between the words, so agent underscore of underscore change. The Friends of Socialist China Twitter is at socialist underscore China. The Friends of Socialist China YouTube is at Friends of Socialist China. And that's it. And the book, my book published in 2023, The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century, can be found at all good bookstores, as can the book that Keith Bennett and I co-edited last year called People's China at 75, The Flag Stays Red, which is, I think, a pretty useful compilation of essays. So that's about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Thanks, KJ.
Bookstores are a moribund, dying business in the United States, destroyed by the monoculture of Amazon. But in China, they are vibrant centers of culture. Their flourishing signals the value attributed to literacy and learning under socialism and are one indication of which direction a society is headed. New and creative bookstores in China show the value and importance that China ascribes to books and learning. This is a bookstore in China, which is set in a cave.